Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call to order this special work session City Council meeting for today, Tuesday, February 17th. We'll start with a roll call, please.
Blessum.
Here.
Fuller.
Here.
Hayes.
Here.
Janser.
Here.
Olson. Olson. Olson.
Did you say Olson?
I did. Sorry, I didn't have
Yes.
the microphone.
Yes, now I can hear you. Yes, I'm here.
Pittner.
Here.
Samuelson.
Here.
All right, very well. So the purpose today is to go through some information and discussion on the budget as a work session, and so I'll pledge. Okay, we didn't.
It is on that one, but not on that one, so
Oh, okay.
if you want to, it's up to
Yeah,
you.
let's do the pledge.
Yeah, we'll do.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Well, I guess we'll proceed by turning the floor over to City Finance Director Dave Litchfield.
Okay, Mr. Mayor, Alderwoman Olson, can you hear me?
Yes, when people are using the mic, I can hear. Otherwise, I cannot.
Perfect. Okay, thank you for all being here today. We'll try to keep this moving because our time is fairly limited. We have a couple of things that we would like to work through here today. In some of our discussion when setting up these work sessions, our thought process was that this is a little bit conversational. We have the dialogue, a little bit of back and forth, answer some questions, get some general guidance. I think our consensus or what we would prefer is that we don't make formal motions or take formal action in these work sessions, that we get guidance and go forward. If we have something that's required for formal action, that we bring that to a subsequent council meeting and have it on an agenda where it's noticed so we can take the formal action at that point, unless something that comes up that we all agree that it needs to have action right away. So the first item that we want to discuss today, some potential modifications of the city's budget ordinance. So we have a couple of things, and we've been in the process of doing this for some time. And what we're looking at here is trying to expedite some of the budget amendments that are more administrative that come to the council. Our current budget ordinance it contradicts itself. So at one point it says as long as there's funding in the fund, as long as there's a adequate appropriation by fund, that it's okay. But then later in the ordinance it says it has to be lined out by line item or has specific detail by line item. So it contradicts itself a little bit. And the practice has been that even sometimes moving money, for example, between a department's operating budget and their capital budget, even though it's within that department's budget, if it exceeds the threshold for capital or if it's not at the threshold for capital, we bring that back for a formal budget amendment that requires 2 readings at the council. Similarly, if we're moving money within a department's budget from one line item to another line item, we've traditionally brought those back. If it's in a different roll code, we've brought them back to council for a formal budget amendment. So we're looking for some guidance from the council. If there's a comfort level to allow some of these administrative budget amendments to go through an approval process administratively and then come to the council in a report quarterly or something to that effect so that it still has transparency and visibility. It just removes some of those, I don't want to call them nuisance budget amendments, but it's more administrative. And sometimes we think that by having all of these come that sometimes the ones that are maybe more important get overlooked or glossed over. So we're just trying to separate out some of the chaff. So when budget amendments come in front of the council, you know that it's significant or there's some certain impact. So the decision here today is what level of detail the council wants to have input on. So, and I have some examples here in the next couple of slides, what an object code detail looks like, what the object code detail looks like, or a budget roll-up code, and then the department level and the fund level. So I know the printout's very small, but on the slide here, you can see this. This is by object code. So every account that we have at the city has its own object code. So when we create the budget, we create a budget, we charge things to each object code. We can report on that. So if we want to require that level of detail, so anything, if it exceeds the budget threshold for that object code, that you want us to come for a formal budget amendment, that's the first option. The next option, this is an example of roll-up codes. So when we adopted the Tyler Munis program, this is something we built into the architecture of the software. So for example, the first roll-up code you see there is salaries. So that includes regular salaries, temporary and part-time, and then overtime. So the items or the object codes that relate directly to salaries. The next one is benefits. They're broken down into other roll-up codes, for example, professional services, department supplies, equipment and supplies, utilities, those types of things. So just rolling up some of those object codes that are all related into a higher category. So that's also an option for management level. This third option, if you were to pick by department, this is the level of detail that we'd be managing to in regards to a budget amendment. You essentially appropriate funds for a department, and as long as we're within that guideline for the department, we wouldn't have any budget amendments. So I guess now have some discussion. I'd like to get some insight from you folks, what's important, or maybe there's some hybrid method or some other way of looking at this, some other criteria. But some discussion would be good, and we have some red line changes, so if we can come up with some guidance here, we can make further modifications to the ordinance and bring it to a future meeting.
Thank you. Dave, the first thing that comes to my mind, and I've got the budget pulled up in front of me, the final budget. Can you tell me, first of all, what we see on there? So I'm looking in the city manager's budget right now, and I see a line item for repair and maintenance, other purchase services. It's that level. Is that the roll-up code that you referenced, or is this even a hybrid of that?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Blessum, so what you see in the budget is by object code.
Object code, okay.
So that is, and just to take this a step further, we would still create the budget using object codes because that's important for us for management purposes. If we get too convoluted, then pretty soon it's garbage in, garbage out too. So I think we would still budget within those object codes and have that line item detail. It's just a matter of when we are exceeding that appropriation, what level do we want to require a formal budget amendment?
Okay, so if I can continue, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead.
So I would say really to the city manager and to you as the finance director, the main thing that I want to make sure that we always avoid in this process is that I don't want to have the feeling of sort of a slush fund, right? I don't want a supplies budget that's $150,000. We know, oh, when it gets to October and we need to move some things around, we've always got some extra. I don't want that feeling, okay? So what I would rather see is, oh, supplies was budgeted at 60. We actually had a need that we got to go to 70. Let's do a budget amendment because we need it, right? So I guess I don't know the right answer to the exact question you're asking, but I know how I feel about it if that helps to start give some of the direction. So I feel like as our sort of financial leaders of the organization, I think you need a comfort level because as we've talked about, Tom, if you're sitting up there having to defend something, I'd like you to be able to defend it, right? And say, yeah, we budgeted, we thought this, but we ended up with this. That's okay. I don't think anybody has any worry about that. I just don't want to ever have this feeling that, oh, we've got an extra, 1.2 million in slush across the city budget because we've got too much flexibility in this process. That's one of my perspectives, I guess I would say.
Further discussion, Alderman Fuller?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess with this, one of the things, for us, how we approach this year's budget, I think will kind of determine where I sit on this. Because last year, I mean, there was some things that, in the normal budget process where we came in, and we said, hey, you know, we're gonna cut this, and so each department said, hey, I wanna cut this out, I wanna cut this out, you know, those are the things we don't need. What concerns me is if we continue to do the budget that way, somebody has told us they wanted to cut out, at the end of the year, they can go ahead and move that money over, and buy those things. And so it kind of circumvents the whole budget process for the council, I think, if we go that direction. So, I mean, if we're gonna do what we talked about this year, where we say, hey, this is your bottom number, and you guys disseminate it however you think it needs to go in each department, I think having some of this in there and implemented is okay, but if we're gonna do it the way we've done it in the past, I'm concerned that it would allow the movement of money to buy things that we said we're not gonna buy, and that's where I would question a little bit of that, so.
And Mr. Mayor, Alderman Fuller, and that's a good point, and I think our thought process here is by utilizing the functionality for roll-up codes. And my best example for this is our utilities roll-up codes. We have MDU, Excel, water, items like that, you know, and it's based on historical averages, what we think the costs are going to do or the prices, but all of a sudden we have an easy winter, or conversely, we have a real harsh winter, and all of a sudden our heating bill is a lot more than we expected it to be. But as long as we have that funding available on that roll-up code, we don't require a formal budget amendment. The way we have drafted the change to the ordinance is if we're going to move money even through an administrative process, it still requires approval by the city manager. So it's not wild, wild west that we can move money wherever we want. It still has a process that it has to go through for city manager approval, and then we would bring a report to the council. The way we have the ordinance change drafted would be quarterly, so the council would be able to weigh in, or at least the transparency and visibility is there of those administrative transfers. So it cleans up some of the contradictory language in the existing ordinance. It modernizes it, allows us to use some of the functionality that we have in the ERP system, gives us a little bit more flexibility, but still gives us the level of detail that we need to create a detailed budget and have those management items that we have so we can manage the budget effectively also. So it's a little bit of a hybrid. If that's the direction we go and we get a year down the path and we decide it didn't work or we want to make further changes, that's something we can always do in the future too.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Jenna, do you have, so Jenna is our comptroller, she's the one that's always working the budget amendment, so I wanted to ask the person who, you know, the extra levy of work comes on and who's our expert in this to, you know, just give some perspective as well. Jenna?
Thank you, City Manager Joyce. Yeah, I think Dave and I are fairly aligned in our preference as far as budget roll-up codes. I do want to go back to your question, Alderman Blessam. If you're looking at the page in the budget that has a little pie chart that says summary, those are budget
That's
roll-up
the side,
codes.
okay.
Yep. And then that subsequent page is going to be line items, and that's what we call object codes. Just want to make sure that we're in
So if I
alignment.
could, Mr. Mayor, so just to clarify that, so in the city, am I on? In the city manager budget, that pie chart, rather than having, you know, buckets for benefits, professional and tech services, infrastructure, repair and maintenance, it's just personnel and operations and maintenance. Is that would be the roll-up level? So you could move within anything operational, but you couldn't move salary to operations? Is that the idea?
The roll-up codes are up above. So
Oh, that is-
You'll
okay.
see CM managers, CM benefits. Those are the budget roll-up codes. So in the words versus the pie chart. The pie chart is just for simplified personnel and operations.
Yep.
But if you see, yeah,
So as I look at this, and maybe you can see it, and we'll
Yep.
have to describe it for those, would we, if I wanted to move money, let's say from professional services to supplies or vice versa, are you, does the current writing still call for us to see that for an approval?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Blessam, in today's world, it would. We would bring a formal budget amendment to the council to.
But in your proposed, it would not?
In the proposed, we would allow transfers within the department, but we would only require that to be done if you exceed your appropriation by roll-up code. So, for example, if my utilities, if I completely exhausted my funding in utilities and I needed to move money from another account or a roll-up code in my department, that I would be able to transfer that money and we would report that to the council. If I had to tap into reserves, for example, if I didn't have enough appropriation at all, we would require a formal budget amendment with 2 readings.
Okay, so just to ask it a little bit different way, and again, I'm focused on Tom's budget because he's the one that gets to answer for this right now. Are what I just described, moving money from supplies to professional and technical services? So we thought we were going to need to buy paper, and now we're bringing in a consultant. Would we have a budget amendment for that in what you're proposing?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Blessam, we would not, but that would, again.
It's
would
subject to
require-
dollars.
Yep.
So it's subject to whatever limits we put on it and having the appropriations overall. So what it does do, there's transparency that comes through the back end of the process. It keeps us from overspending as a whole, especially as a department, but it doesn't do what I'm talking about. And again, I like to talk about this stuff before we do it because we don't have an instance where anybody's done anything wrong. That's the good news, right? So what I'm worried about is if we had a city manager who padded his supplies budget because he knew he needed some room to wiggle, you could do that and the council wouldn't see it other than a consent item a couple months later. I think right now, that's the proposal that's in the written ordinance.
Yeah, and Mr. Mayor, Alderman Blessam, and we're obviously very sensitive to that as well. The one thing that comes along with that is typically, if we're moving money to some of those other roll-up codes, it would require a contract as well, which council still would have to sign off and approve the contract. So that would be something that would still require council action. So if we're bringing that item to council, I would suggest that we do the budget amendment with it at the same time, so it's fully transparent that the 2 are linked together. Again, one thing with prior councils, and I know they can't obligate future councils, but they had kind of drawn the line in the sand that we're not okay with taking salary savings and buying a new car or something just because we're short-staffed. That doesn't mean that, we appropriated that in your budget for a person. If you're short-staffed the entire year, you don't get to go and buy something else. And that was kind of the line that they had drawn in the sand. So there's some ways that we can accommodate that administratively or use those guardrails administratively. That's not an option, even though it's object code to object code, that's off limits, that would require a council action too. The biggest thing here is I think we're okay, whatever the council decides. We just want to clear up the contradictory language in the budget so that we know we're all operating by the same set of rules and we can be consistent going forward and everybody knows exactly what's expected of them. Any other questions? So I guess if we can get maybe a little bit of a consensus, if everyone's okay with that, we will continue modifying or bring our proposed budget ordinance changes to the next council agenda for a little more detailed review, and we can make modifications or changes at that point too. But we wanted to at least make sure we're heading down a path that we're on the right page anyway. Okay, all right, that'll be coming soon to a council agenda near you.
As drafted, right?
Yep. Okay, the next time that we want to take here is I want to go back and look at some things that we did in preparing the 2026 budget. I want to look at some projections high level. Again, just to have some discussion. We brought this up here, I think the last work session, that we would prefer or like some general guidance on where we want to start with the 2027 budget. So I thought it was important to have a little bit of context with, where we were historically to some extent, and what that looks like if we project that out the next 2 years, where we see things going. So the first item that we have here, I just wanted to go back and remind the council a little bit of when we prepared the 2026 budget. We went through the 3 different scenarios, the plus 3%, the minus 3%, and the flat budget. However, the flat budget was flat for 2026. There was an escalator built in for 27 and 28. And in those escalators, and that was dollars for the department overall, not each individual line item. And we included some escalators in there for things like salaries, benefits, the health insurance, retirement, all of those things. So, for example, if we said we thought health insurance was going to go up 15%, well, we put those numbers in, and then you had to reach your 3% overall, including that 15% increase in health insurance. So there's some other things that we want to discuss here too, some trends that we see, increasing delinquencies, our declining interest revenues, and this is a combination of different things. We had forecasted declining revenues starting in 2025. We were able to stave off some of that just with managing some of the funds that we had. Interest rates didn't decline as quick as we thought they were going to, and we didn't spend the reserves down early in the year as soon as we thought. So our revenue collections were favorable for 2025. However, looking forward in 26 and 27 and 28 with what we are budgeting to spend in reserves, obviously we're going to draw down those funds. I think the consensus across the board is we're probably going to see some more cuts in the Fed rate, which is going to mean a decrease in rates for us as well. A lot of our investments are in short-term funds, money markets, and short-term CDs, just because that's where we're getting the best interest rate, believe it or not. So we're susceptible to those interest rate changes in the near term. And in sales tax collections, we had a bit of a decrease in 2025. So that's a little bit of a wild card where we think that's going to end up in future years as well. So again, the guidance that we had for 2026, what we're looking for 27 is, what's the guidance? Are we looking at a flat dollar amount? Are we looking at a percentage or within the caps, or just a general consensus? And again, I don't think we're married to this guidance at this point. If we get the marching orders that this is what we want to see when we present the initial budget or when we're creating the budget, that's what we're going to shoot for a goal. And then we can modify from there. But we have to have some place to start. So this slide just shows on the assumptions that we used when we created the 2026 budget and the projections for 27 and 28. So some of the escalators that were included in there. So it's not 3% across the board. There were some other things that came into play. Okay. So this is a historical chart with the actual dollars levied and the corresponding mill rates. And the bars there that are the different texture in the middle, we have one of those for every stage of the 2026 budget. So the preliminary budget, or the city manager's recommended budget, was just north of $29 million, and that essentially represented the max that we could levy for property taxes at that point based on the calculations. And through the process of the budget, we reduced that to the final adopted budget was just over $20 million in property taxes levied. So each step along the way, we're able to reduce that a little bit, and then the corresponding mill levy that goes along with that. So this graph takes those same dollar amounts in dollars levied, and the horizontal line there just goes back in time and represents what the tax levy that was levied for 2026 looks like historically in dollars. So $20,100,754. And if we look back in time, we had to go back to 2017 to find a year where we actually levied less in dollars than we did in 2026. If you adjust these numbers for inflation, you actually have to go back to 2014 to find a year where we actually levied less than we did in 2026 in inflation-adjusted dollars. If we take the 2015 amount that was levied and adjust for inflation, it's just north of $22 million in today's dollars. And this is just a screenshot of the CPI inflation calculator that I used for the Midwest region to calculate that. Okay, so this shows what the dollars levied and the mill rate would look like if we stayed flat at the 2026 levy amount. So the key takeaway from here is we're assuming some increase in property values for the next couple of years and some growth to come along there. So if we decided that 20,100,754 is the target number that we're shooting for, and we expect property values to grow and have some new growth, we would see a corresponding decline in the mill rate just because we would have that same dollar amount spread over a larger base, so it's going to reduce the rate that's applied to the individual property. So this is the doomsday slide a little bit, and I don't want to get everybody excited and I don't want to be super negative, but this just goes through looking at what we anticipated having on hand at the end of 2025, what's required for our 1/12 reserve, the minimum required by ordinance, what we have budgeted in 2026 to use for reserves, and then what we have in the current projected budget for 27 and 28 to use for reserves if we stay at that flat $20 million number for the tax levy. So what this is saying is that in 2028, we would be $3.4 million below our 1/12 reserve. Now, there's a lot of assumptions that come into play with that. So I don't want us to get too wrapped up in this. It just shows that the trajectory, we have to make some changes, essentially. In the next few graphs, I'll kind of walk us through this. So this slide shows, again, the top, I guess kind of a purple line, shows what we have for the last few years in our general fund spending, and then what we have projected for 27 and 28, again, based on that flat scenario that we created when we created the 26 budget. The middle line there is the combination of sales tax dollars and property tax dollars. And the reason I used sales tax in here as well is because there's a component of sales tax that goes to property tax relief. So they are a little bit related. I have another slide that strips out the sales tax and it focuses just on property tax to show that relation. And then the bottom line, the lighter blue line, is the anticipated amount of reserves that we'd have if this scenario plays out for the next 2 years, exactly the way it's budgeted or forecast. That's the trajectory we're on. And then the bold red line on the bottom represents the 1/12 reserves that we have required by ordinance today. So the takeaway was when we get to 28, we're going to be below the 1/12 reserve, just what the slide before this pointed out. Okay, this slide shows, again, the same information except the revenue line depicts just the property tax component. Okay, so again, the key takeaway here, and I'm going to try to do some techie stuff here, so we'll see if it works. I'm going to try to draw on here. So the takeaway is this delta between these lines here. It's about $32 million. So typically how we make that up is other revenues. So it might be Hub City dollars, state revenues, federal revenues, fees for service, interest revenues, all of these other things that are not property tax. The key takeaway is when we get down here, this delta that we have, if we stay on this trajectory, you know, it's $58 million roughly. So the difference between the 32 million and the 58 million is our problem. Okay, and again, there's a lot of things that play into that, a lot of things that are in our control, and a lot of things are not in our control as well. But that's the key takeaway here. The actual numbers probably aren't as important. It's the trajectory that we're going on. If these lines stayed more flat, then this delta stays more consistent and it's a lot more manageable, if that makes sense. Okay, so this is just an example, one example. So what I did here is I took the $20,100,754 that was levied in 26, and I came up, I just used a multiplier. I assumed 4%, meaning 3% represented by the cap under the current state law, and I assumed about 1% for new growth. So I used 4% on the dollar amount levied, but then I also assumed that 4% on the increase in values. So what that did for us is it increased the actual number of dollars that we would levy. In 27 would be just under 21 million. In 28 would be 21.7 million. But if you look at the rate going across here, it stays almost exactly the same. It's not going to allow me to point on it, but it does stay within a couple of hundreds. And because the dollar amount and the actual value are going up at the same rate, so the math comes out that they work out almost identically. And this just depicts what would happen in that scenario if the amount in the expenditure side stayed the same. We took advantage of the 3% increase, just like we showed there. It still shows that we're below the 1/12 reserve in 2028. So that leads us to the next steps, or what we have to do. So obviously, we can't continue on this path indefinitely because we run out of ability or capacity at some point. So how do we correct this? And there isn't going to be a magic bullet here. There's not going to be a singular solution that will solve this completely. It's going to have to be a multi-pronged approach. And that's going to mean we have to make some decisions going forward. So the key takeaway is we have to reduce that delta between the change in expenditures and the change in revenues. We can't continue to have expenditure growth outpace revenue growth. So that means new revenue sources from wherever it comes from, if it's fees or grants or wherever it has to keep up with the expenditure growth. The one option that I think needs to be considered is implementing expenditure reductions sooner than later. I mean, we can't wait till 2028 to implement changes on that side because it would be so drastic just to get where we need to be. It would have significant negative impacts to the operations. Exploring additional revenue opportunities, whatever that means. That's something that we'd have to go down. I know some things that have been tossed around in the past were franchise fees for some of our folks that operate in the right-of-way. That's not warmly received by some of our community partners, and it's essentially a pass-through. So the consumer ends up paying that anyway. So it's kind of a tax is a tax is a tax. It's just a matter of how it's distributed and how it's collected. The final thing that I think is the elephant in the room is strict fiscal management, and I think that's what, regardless of what the approach is, that's going to have to be a component of it going forward. Okay, that's my scenario, and again, I don't want this to be dire straits, but I also want us to have our eyes wide open and give us time to react and make course changes as well.
Alderman Blessum.
Thank you. So I guess I'll maybe take a little bit of a point of privilege here. We decided to do away with the president's letter this summer, which I voted for and I think seconded. At the same time, I think I do have a responsibility in this process, at least historically, to give some perspective and give my point of view on what all this is and what it all looks like. First thing I would say is that, Dave, if you don't mind jumping back to one of the graphs, that one's fine, that shows it. So I believe with the 25 budget, we had a sense of where we were headed. We had a different council, we had a different set of voices coming through that council that were, at least from our perspective, giving what we were hearing from the community. We took that step in 25. Expenditures were, they went up a little bit, but maybe not with the same rate that they could have. 26, that really took hold, and I think we had a different process. We had a different way of going about things, and our gap went crazy. And I'll take full blame for the blue line going down. I pushed as hard as I could to push it that direction. The line going up, I'm actually a little disappointed in, because I would hope that everybody involved in putting together what that line looks like understood the playing field that we were on and where we were headed. Unfortunately, we dug the hole deeper on that side of the equation. And so even if we decide to adjust the bottom side and start to bring reserves back in line, whatever anybody wants to think about with that on the revenue side, the expenditure side went strongly up. And the thing that I don't quite understand with that is I look at a budget that shows salaries only up about 1.5%, which is great. Benefits actually down slightly across the board, which is tremendous. So, there are other things in general fund. There are things that to this day I don't understand. There's a big debt item for $4.5 million. There's, we had huge new expenditures on the city council side related to public transit and things like that. So some of it's explainable. At the end of the day, though, I think your last slide is really where we've got to get serious, and it's got to come from all sides of that. I'm not going to sit here and say that we can't have additional revenue coming into the city. I would prefer to see that from growth. That's what we always hear about. If the tax base goes up, we should have more revenue coming in, right? That's what we do a whole bunch of stuff in this city for, is to try to drive that. With that in mind, the way that I look at this right now, giving you my perspective, what I would like us to see is to start with 20.1 as our starting point, and then to layer in new growth. And by my calculations, I talked to Ryan, I think Ryan's here. I went back and forth with him on a little bit of stuff in the last day. To me, that it's not a lot. We're talking, maybe 1% overall in terms of the new growth, which only adds up to $250,000, maybe $250,000, something like that. So from my perspective, I'd like to see our starting point target for staff to work towards as flat 26 plus that growth. And then as we get further into the process and we understand, here's what kind of the nice to haves are on top of that, I can look towards what the state law allows up to the 3%, but to me, it's right in that range. I know that we left ourselves the ability to go maybe back to 24 plus some change. To me, that should be off the table. That's not doing what the intent of the law was, and I think we don't need to go there short of a calamity in our world. And so that would be my perspective to the rest of the council, is that we start at 20.1, we layer in the new growth, which is what we do a ton of different programs to try to drive, and we use that as our starting point for property tax. Now, I'm not crazy. I know what that means. It likely means another very strong number coming off reserves. That's where we sit today, because I don't think we can solve the expense side of the equation in 1 year. I know that we can't, and we dug the hole deeper. So it's going to take us a little bit to get out of that. And then, some of it comes down to, do we spend another $5 million as was contemplated on the police department in year 2? We're on a track that's supposed to be 3 years. That was sort of the agreement that was made. That was almost $15 million over 3 years. Can we support that? I don't know. But that's what's going to happen to the reserve number. Of the 11 million we spent, or we were going to spend in 26, 5 of that is the police department alone, which is part of the reason why the reserve exists in the first place, both in mentality and in actual dollars. So that's actually the right trade-off. The rest of that, you know, that is on us as we are making decisions about what that levy looks like. But we need both pieces working together to get there. And so that's sort of my president's message right there. That would be my proposal, is that we do roughly 20.4 as a target, whatever that growth number is on top of the 26 number, and that's our starting point.
Other comments, other discussion?
Mr. Mayor, I just want to make clear too that these numbers do reflect the future allocation to the police department. So that drives a lot of that use of reserves as well. But I think in 2028, that delta was a little over 14, almost 15 million, including that 5 million for the police department. So even if you strip that out, we're at a deficit of almost $10 million a year. So even if we didn't fund year 2 and 3 of the police department, that buys us one additional year without making major course correction. It just means then 29 is where we cross the red line versus 28. So that's why when the options that we had here, you know, I think, and certainly we will have that as a starting point, and I think it makes more sense to have a clear target instead of bringing a budget that shows what the absolute max is, kind of what happened last year, and then we start from there. I think having some guidance, we can create a budget that shoots for that number, and then we can identify the impacts that it'll have and where those cuts would have to come from to hit that number. Then we can also project what it'll look like in future years too. So it gives us a good starting off point. However, I think there's some things that we're also going to have to correct on the expenditure side of things because it's just not sustainable over time. So, and I think the sooner that we start heading down that path and taking a look at it, the less drastic it'll have to be at a point in the future.
Mr. Mayor, are you able to hear me?
Yes, Alderman Olson.
Pardon me, was someone else speaking? I can wait.
No, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you. Just a few thoughts from the virtual world this afternoon. I think it's really risky to start a conversation now on whether or not we are going to support using the reserve dollars for the police department. We had a lot of discussion about that last fall. We took it in pieces so that we were not subtracting 15 million all at one time because we really didn't know what the cost would be for a rehabilitation at the police department. But it is dangerous, risky, unfair to start insinuating now that maybe we wouldn't consider year 2 and year 3 when we still don't know a number. But I think that through the discussion that we had, we all agreed that funding the rehabilitation was something that as stewards of city finances and city infrastructure that we need to do. So I'm hoping that that discussion does not go much further. As far as using other reserves, I think this was part of our conversation last year too, in that we did spend down some of our reserves, but in doing so, we are not being honest with the residents of Minot in telling them what the actual cost of doing business is, the actual cost of providing services. And so no one wants to see a tax increase. I agree with that 100%. And starting out with a flat budget is nice, but I don't think that we're going to find out that we can provide the services at that flat budget, particularly into the next couple of years, I think an increase is probably going to happen, and that's something that we'll have to have a good conversation about. I don't think that the funding for that the increased costs should come from reserves. Thank you.
Any other comments? Alderman Pittner?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, I see where you're coming from, Mike, with wanting to maintain that flat budget. And again, you've made it no secret to your desire to reduce levels of reserves and get them in line to where you feel they should be. And I just don't feel that's a sustainable practice to the point of Alderman Olson's comments. I see where that leads us, right? It backs us into a corner where we have no option, right? Like we go past the 3 cap, we get away from 2024, we're stuck with that. It's, we got to cut off a limb at that point to make ends meet. I tend to agree. I think falling in line, again, balancing that, we were $8 million, I think, over $8 million more in reserves from 2025 to 2026. Granted, $5 million came for the police station, so an additional $3 million of just subsidizing the budget out of reserves. Again, we've heard city government should run like a business, should be run with business acumen. I don't know any business that can just continually draw on reserves to function to where it becomes irreparable. So again, I think finding some balance. I don't know if I necessarily like the maintaining of where we were last year. I don't know. I don't think we have to go back maybe to where 2024 was, but somewhere in between there. And again, this is the city manager's budget. I trust the city manager. Maybe I'll put him on the spot to what this is our direction to drive this conversation, but I want to know what you need to make this organization as successful as possible. You hear from citizens maybe more than we do on some scenarios, or people that are in the streets. So where do you feel our budget needs to be long term to be successful, not just next year?
So Mayor Janser, Alderman Pittner. So I want to bring up. I'm looking, it says page 20 of mine. It's the general fund expenditures by function slide. This one, you can just make it a little bit bigger. Just a reminder to everybody, right? This is the reminder. We have a $216 million budget, but just 70 some was what we just addressed, the general fund. 2/3 of our overall budget is enterprise funds, right? Which are operated like businesses. We want to operate the nonprofit side like a business too, but just a reminder really where that is, right? So that's it in front of you. It's your police department, it's your fire department, it's your streets. Much of what we do is streets and traffic. That's general fund. The street department, Kevin Broughton, snow removal, patching, so a combination there. And then it's general services. It's the city assessor's office. It's the finance office. It's HR. It's the city manager's office. Just the reminder where that is. So I don't have a crystal ball, obviously, but I will just tell you from my gut, it's not sustainable. I don't mind starting with a number at all. I've started with a number of times. I'd much rather start with a number. I appreciate starting with a number, okay? But what I owe back to you as we go through this is what I would refer to as unfunded requirements. Like I'm going to say, I believe these are requirements based on the number, and if that's the number that's approved, as the council goes through the budget for 27, I would call that an unfunded requirement. So it also, to kind of get back to a point you made earlier, Alderman Fuller, I want to address, if we get to that point, what I feel are still requirements. They're just unfunded. That over the course of the year, if monies come available, I want to be able to go back to council and say, this was an unfunded requirement. We showed you where it was high on the list. But every business has a cut line. There's a cut line. You're above the line or you're below the line. And just because you're below the line, that doesn't mean you're not an important function. And we would like to fund you if resources were available. But with resources being what they are and they're tight, we're not going to be able to fund everything. So I want to be able to have that conversation if we get to those points. But I don't mind starting with a number and then just coming back to you on what where I feel we'd have to make reductions to get to that number. We went through the drill last year. The departments did a great job of briefing council on just what the -3% would be. That's, my direction would be start with your, I talked about it at the last department head meeting, start with your -3 2027. Start with that. For the departments, right? Let's start going line item by line item. Again, they're getting a head start. They're 3 or 4 months ahead of where we were last year doing this. But, get to that. And then what I would like to do is, just really, going through that. What's the impact if we don't do X? What's the impact if we don't do Y? I've scratched my head, and I really can't figure out a big ticket item to do away with, to literally do away with. I mean, I think all of our municipal services are important services. But to be frank, I mean, the easy button, and I don't like it because it's exactly opposite of what we get from community satisfaction survey, is easy button is starting to reduce what we had plussed up in streets over the last couple of years. So we just take more of that. That's just top of my head. But as we go through that, we owe you more than the easy button. The easy button can maybe save millions, but we owe more to really just delve through this. But I think the biggest challenge as we move forward is really just finding those alternative revenue sources. Just because I just don't see significant savings in expenditures. I'm not saying we can't get after savings. I always want to get after savings. Our former city manager, Harold Stewart, talked about marginal gains. We're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep doing process improvement. We always are getting after efficiencies, but I just don't see anything huge without eliminating a service. And I just don't know which one to, that I can even think of eliminating at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Tom, to your point, you're right. There isn't going to be an easy button here, and I would like to kind of point something out. Jennifer, could you bring up Dave's slides, page 5, number 10, the one that shows the annual increases or decreases in property tax, please? I want everybody to take a look at the years 2017, 2018, and 2019. We had a $9 million increase in property tax that we took from the people. And I think most people would ask, what did we get extra for that $9 million? Now, you go to 2020, it didn't go down after COVID in 2021. That's just a reduction in the value of homes. We didn't actually drop the levy mill. So what we see here, guys, is an unrestricted path of growth that nobody ever said no to. And so the city grew to that size. And they took the money and they spent it. And we're absolutely right. Now it's going to hurt when we start to take it back. You see, we have to figure out ways to do this, because the people in Minot, the reason I was elected, the reason Scott, Mike, most of us were put on here was because they were tired of being taxed to death. And we've finally been able to bring it back a little bit. So while I agree, Tom, I wish there was an easy button. There isn't one. This is stuff where we're going to have to get creative. The federal government's doing it. Other state governments do it. Maybe we have to start looking at early retirements and see if people are willing to take that and start cutting payroll in that form rather than just waiting for people to retire, resign, or whatever may be needed. We're going to have to come up with some ideas, but cutting spending absolutely has to be one of them. You cannot look at that chart and say, hey, we've been doing the right thing, because while Lisa, Alderwoman Olson, says the cost of doing business, what did we get for $9 million in 2018 and 2019? I think, and I'm not being rude, I'm not saying we didn't get anything, but I think if you ask the general public, they would say nothing has really changed. The streets still aren't getting cleaned. Neighborhoods still are low on police officers rolling through there because we've been short of officers. There's a lot of things that have taken a back seat, but spending hasn't ever been one of them. And I think we have to address it. And I wish it was going to be easy. I really do. But it's something that we have to address, because we let the growth as the city happen. We're the ones that have to fix it now. So.
Alderman Blessam.
Thank you. And, you know, Alderman Fuller just hit on something that I want to point out to everybody. So the state of North Dakota is getting big warning signs right now at the legislature about OMB bringing back lower than expected money coming in. You know, the reserves that they had heading into the current biennium are not expected to be there, and they're taking action. And they're not taking action by saying, okay, where can we go find the extra $2 billion that we're going to need? They're taking action by saying, where do we cut? You know, just like hopefully most of us would in our households. You know, a lot of times when I look at this stuff, I look at it and I go, I take off 3 zeros, right? You look at our reserve levels. If I'm a couple and I've got $42,000 in the bank, and I run into some rough times, yeah, I might spend some reserves down, right? I might spend it down to 30, which is kind of roughly what we did. Might go down to 30,000. But at some point, hopefully, I start saying, is it sustainable what we're spending? Because I can go get a part-time job. I can go get something to try to bring in some extra revenue, but at some point, I've got to decide this lifestyle, this path that we're on is not sustainable, and I've got to make that adjustment. I don't want our city government to be the only place where we're not able to do that. I know that we can, because I know that we had a team last year that did a ton of hard work to get there, which is why I'm still baffled with how the numbers look the way they do. There's something that doesn't register for me exactly right. But the point is, it's going to take more of that. And it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be fun, but it may take a right sizing. I've said the numbers before that in 2013, we were at 320 city employees. Today, we're almost 500. Our population is down slightly from 2013. Now, you can make the case that we were a little short at that time and that we had to grow some from there, but I'm not sure it's 50%. And so we're going to have to find a way to start moving that needle. And nobody's saying go cut a department. I just want to be clear about that. That's not at all what the intent is here, but we've got to figure out ways, just like a household would, to make the expenditures fit the revenue. And again, I'm speaking for myself, but I think others would probably agree. I'm willing to do the work on the revenue side if I feel good about the expenditure side. Then it makes sense, right? If we've got the growth working the way the finance director talked about and they're running parallel, yeah, I'm willing to work in the margins to make sure that that works. But when they're diverging, I'm not willing to do the catch up on the revenue side. I'm not. We've got to have a good amount coming from the other side as well.
Mr. Mayor, if I can, just to be clear, and I did the calculation, if we went back to the 2024 levy amount and we levied the max, we still can't get there on the revenue side over time. So that's why I said early on, there isn't a single fix to this. It's going to have to be a multi-pronged approach to make things work long-term. So even if the decision was to take the absolute maximum allowed under the law, it just prolongs the inevitable a couple of more years. So I think having a starting point, it gives us some guidance and direction that we have a starting off point and we can evaluate what we would live without and bring those directions or those suggestions back to council, and then the council can weigh in on what they think of that approach, and we'll go from there. Okay, no more questions. We'll work on getting the budget ordinance cleaned up, have that on one of the upcoming agendas. We have that direction moving forward, and then we will start working forward on this directive. And just to reiterate a couple of things, we're still really early in this process, and like Alderman Blessum said, we made assumptions, and like you alluded to, oil revenues coming down, that could impact us because we're a hub city. We get some funding from the state that is dependent on oil revenues, so we could see some impacts there as well. We're a little early in the game. The way the funding formula works right now, we're a little bit insulated from that, at least early on and when the changes start happening. However, that can change in the next legislative session as well. So that's definitely an unknown, both from what production and oil economics look like, plus legislative changes as well.
Okay. Any other comments? All right, seeing none, is there a motion to adjourn the work session? Moved and seconded, we adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay?